heard cries for help. Help, help, and no don't. It must have been half an hour later, a child cried out real loud, like it was hurt.
It was the fear of not knowing who amongst them was capable of abducting a little girl that was terrifying for the residents of Queensville. Stepping outside meant praying that their neighbor wasn't a killer. When 9-year-old Christine Jessop went missing on October 3, 1984, the heartbreak and shock were palpable. And as hundreds of people searched for her, there was one individual who went unnoticed. How did Christine disappear from her house in broad daylight? What happened to her? Welcome to M7 Crime Storytime, where we shed light on solved, unsolved, and mysterious cases across the country. Today, we're looking at a case with an insane twist. But first, if you haven't subscribed to our channel by now, please consider hitting the subscribe and like buttons. Let's dive deep into the mystery without further ado. Welcome to Queensville, a small town where stories rest in eternal embrace. While the city continued to grow and expand with more malls and neighborhoods, Queensville held on to its rural charm. It served as a refuge, preserving the simplicity of country life amidst the bustling metropolis. Nestled between the fields and forests, it's separated from the Toronto city by a few contracting kilometers and a 4-lane expressway. Queensville is little more than a dusty crossroads. It's a place where nature still has a fighting chance. Before one fateful day in 1984, few would have given Queensville a second thought. But soon, it became the center of attention, where a horrible tragedy occurred that changed the entire community forever. The story began in the early 1970s. Robert Bob Jessop and Janet Jessop's journey to have a child was not an easy one. After struggling to conceive, they welcomed a baby boy, Ken, through adoption. But fate had a surprise in store for them. A miracle occurred, and Christine Marion Jessop was born on November 29, 1974, catching her parents off guard. Her early years were plagued with health problems, and her frequent hospital stays were a source of constant worry for her family. However, Christine was a fighter. She was the spitting image of her mother, exhibiting both maturity and childlike innocence simultaneously. Her love for all things delicate was unmatched, and she had dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Every week, Christine's visits to the Balladen farm to play with the animals were a highlight of her life. Christine's tendency to talk a lot, or as some might say, her motor mouth, was often misinterpreted as childish behavior. However, she was a bright, inquisitive girl who loved to ask questions and learn new things. The fall of 1984 was in full swing, and the Jessop family had a secret they were carefully guarding. Everyone thought that Bob, Christine's father, had embarked on a business trip to California. In reality, he was behind bars, serving time for charges of financial fraud. Meanwhile, Janet, Christine's mother, had the plan to ensure that she was always there to greet Christine as she stepped off the school bus every afternoon. Janet used to rush home from work at the Sears store in Richmond Hill. On that warm day of October 3, 1984, Christine was bursting with excitement to show off her new recorder to her mother and her brother Ken. She walked out of school with her friend Leslie Chipman and spent about 20 minutes playing on the swings. They decided to meet up later that day. At 3:50 p.m., when she entered the house, Christine knew that nobody was home. Her mother had informed her earlier that she was going to visit her dad in prison and take 14-year-old Ken to the dentist. There was a possibility they'd be back by 4, but it was uncertain. The only company for Christine was her lively dog, Freckles. She looked for a nickel in the dish full of coins before leaving the house and attempted to call her friend Leslie, but the line was busy. So she made her way to the general store to buy herself some bubble gum. Then she walked her bike across Leslie Street into her driveway. By 4:10 p.m., Janet and Ken returned home. They saw Christine's red bike lying on its side with a bent handlebar and carrier. Janet noticed that Christine's jacket was hanging on a high peg, which was unusual since she couldn't have reached it without a chair. Ken called out to her in the basement, wondering if she might be spending time with her beloved pet frog, Harold, but there was no response. Something was definitely wrong. They decided to wait until supper, hoping that she'd come home soon. But as the hours passed, Janet's fear grew stronger, and by 7 p.m., she knew she had to call the police.
We looked everywhere. And then finally I thought, well, I think we better call the police. Something's wrong.
The sergeant who handled the call had a gut feeling that something was amiss and sent a car right away. As word spread of Christine's disappearance, the Queensville Fire Department sprang into action, followed closely by volunteer firemen from nearby areas. Before long, a swarm of concerned citizens were scouring every inch of the neighborhood, from the fields and graveyards to the dense forest below the ridge. It was a search like no other in Canadian history. The town was united in their desperate search for Christine, but the looming question remained, where could she have gone? The detectives considered the possibility that she'd run away to see her father in prison, or that she'd stayed with a friend for longer than expected. But all these theories led to dead ends. When the police knocked on the door of Christine's 24-year-old neighbor, Guy Paul Morin, he initially thought it was about a complaint regarding his construction work. But then he surprised his father, Alphonse, by saying, "I bet that little Christine is gone." Guy Paul and his father often played a game of predicting events, though they never actually bet money on it. Alphonse suggested, "No, maybe Ken. Ken's at that age of socializing where he's starting to get into trouble." Alphonse was surprised at how easily his son won the bet this time, as Christine was really missing. The police asked some basic questions, then went away. While the entire town was searching for a girl they didn't even know, her next-door neighbors, the Morin family, preferred to stay at home. Detective John Nichet took it upon himself to break the news of Christine's disappearance to her father, Bob Jessop. Other inmates at the jailhouse began to pressure the guards and administrators to release Bob so he could be with his family. The next day, on October 4th, 1984, Leslie, Christine's friend, informed the officers that Christine had received a hate letter from two of her friends. So the detectives went to Christine's school to analyze the theory that her disappearance was the result of a school-based rivalry. The principal of Queensville Public School, Ross Brethur, had informed the media that all 106 students at the school received street-proofing education to prevent such incidents as Christine's abduction. It involved identifying and responding to uncomfortable and dangerous situations. He'd instructed the staff to keep the incident low-key. Nevertheless, things had taken an unexpected turn, and the school became a hub of chaos, fear, and rumors in just a few hours. With parents becoming more paranoid and protective of their children, homicide detective John Shepard noticed a change in the atmosphere of Queensville after Christine Jessop's disappearance. Several theories were developed based on the circumstances surrounding Christine's disappearance. One theory was that Christine might have seen an adult figure and dropped her bike. But did she drop her bike in fright at the sight of a stranger? Or was it just an absent-minded action in response to a familiar face smiling at her? The time frame was really narrow. Either the killer lucked out, or he had an intimate knowledge of the family's schedule. There'd been no ransom demand yet, and the possibility of a slaying by a deranged person was unusual, but not impossible. On the same day of October 3rd, 1984, there were 4 phone calls that came into the Jessop residence, with the caller remaining silent before hanging up. At this time, everyone was a suspect. The investigators suspected that one of Ken's friends might have had a dark desire for the young girl, so they asked Ken to provide a list of his friends' names. They were on high alert as Bob's absence added a layer of mystery to the case, raising questions about whether Christine had been snatched by someone who knew that Bob was no longer in the picture. Was it possible that even a fellow inmate had taken Christine in an act of revenge? Or was the disappearance somehow linked to the fraud that had landed Bob in jail? The search for Christine had gone stagnant until a tip from a neighboring town led the York Regional Police to Dean McPhail, a troubled teenager known for carrying a knife. His criminal record included tying up a woman, exposing himself to 2 girls, and assaulting a 10-year-old boy. And if that wasn't enough, MacPhail had also worked briefly as a gravedigger at the Queensville cemetery, giving him ample opportunity to observe Christine's movements. Even his probation officer had urged the police to consider him as a suspect, but it did not pan out. Another theory was that Gordon Simpson, Janet's father, and his new wife Hilda had kidnapped their own granddaughter because they were wary of the way Janet was raising Christine in Bob's absence. Hilda had been intrusive and critical of everything Janet did, and always said the weirdest things. When the Jessop couple moved into their Queensville residence, Hilda said, "Something terrible would happen to Christine in this house." It led many to speculate that she was involved in Christine's disappearance. Later, some of her neighbors came forward with another revelation about Christine. They claimed that she often hung out with boys until late at night, sometimes even walking home with them at 9 or 10 p.m. Christine had told her friends about an older boyfriend. It was the opposite of what Janet had told the police. When Detective John Nashe visited Janet, Christine's mother, he was taken aback by her calm demeanor. All she said was, "Hi," and didn't ask any questions about any leads. Wally Rabson, Bob's brother-in-law, told the detectives that something's not right here. Janet just seems to be completely unaffected by what's going on. However, the detectives knew that people grieve differently, so they gave Janet the benefit of the doubt and didn't reveal their suspicions to the public. However, Sally Browning, a family friend, mentioned that when Janet's mother died, she had to take Valium to calm herself. Yet, with her missing daughter, Janet seemed relaxed. She kept saying Christine was safe and warm in a wooded building and would be home soon. People suspected that the whole disappearance was staged to get Bob out of jail, who was, in fact, released within 3 days on October 6, 1984 on humanitarian grounds. Soon, the entire village, including Bob himself, had thoughts about an unbothered mother of a missing child.
She wouldn't hurt anybody. Just wouldn't hurt anybody at all.
Queensville had never been more active. Within days, different sightings of unusual activity in the area were reported. The first one came from Sandra and Bruce Horwood, who witnessed a disturbing sight while driving. A man in a greenish-blue car was forcefully holding a struggling child under his arm. They debated following the car, but decided that he could have been a parent. All over the town, there was talk of a white, off-white, or silver car seen during the time of Christine's disappearance. Detectives received a promising tip from 3 boys who went searching for Christine on a country road outside Newmarket. A silver Datsun stopped beside them, driven by a man about 25 years old, offering to help with a searchlight attached to his dashboard. However, his car was covered in mud and had a repulsive smell. He ducked down when he thought a police car was coming toward them and rushed away immediately. It hadn't been a police car, just another vehicle searching for Christine. But it was disappointing for the detectives that no other information about this mystery man could be recovered. As the investigation dragged on, a glimmer of hope emerged in the form of a diary found by 2 curious kids in a rundown barn. Mike Lundgren, Jessop's neighbor, took a friend with him to inspect the barn. But what they found in the barn was straight out of a horror movie. Rusty pulleys and chains lay strewn around like torture devices, and a giant spider web made of a fishing line almost ensnared them. It was the cryptic writing scrawled on the walls that really sent shivers down their spines. The phrases, "Finally see the bird disappears," and "Read the words are hidden," were eerily odd. They located a man who rented the farmhouse nearby. He claimed the dairy as his own and said that an artist had written those words on the walls for his failed love. The dark shadows of suspicion loomed over everyone. But there was Philip Brennan, a man accused of unspeakable crimes against his own flesh and blood. His wife had bravely come forward to report the disturbing allegations of his inappropriate behavior with their 5-year-old daughter. The authorities scoured his home and uncovered horrific adult content, but his alibi seemed to hold up. Yet the lingering doubt remained. Months passed by, the investigation into Christine's disappearance was at a standstill, and Bob Jessop was growing increasingly frustrated. Little did he know he was going to find a clue. While cleaning out his garage one day, he stumbled upon a crumpled piece of paper. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was a map, crudely drawn but unmistakable. And shockingly, it showed a route to his own home. He traced the faint lines with his eyes as they led many kilometers eastward to a portion of Durham region. Bob immediately called for his wife Janet, and together they tried to make sense of the map. They eventually realized that it terminated awfully close to the home of Hector Drummond, an old family friend of Janet's father who visited the Jessop home 3 or 4 times a year. Janet's mother had once claimed that Hector was an odd fellow who liked dressing up in women's clothing, but over the years, she felt comfortable around him. After looking at the map, Janet and Bob knew they had to figure out the truth themselves. They visited Hector's house and found a notepad on the table. After examining it in bright light, Bob was shocked to find faint lines of the same map on the pad. Despite being a family friend, Hector Drummond was not immune to suspicion. The police investigated him thoroughly, but he was eventually cleared of any involvement in Christine's disappearance. The discovery of the map was just another bizarre twist in a case that seemed to be full of red herrings and dead ends. As the sun rose on December 31st, 1984, Fred Patterson noticed something strange happening in the nearby field in Sunderland, Ontario, approximately 100 kilometers northeast of Toronto. His German Shepherd was roaming around with a stray Great Dane, both barking sporadically. The field, north of Patterson's home and south of the 4th concession, was owned by James Cull, a high school vice principal from Toronto. Patterson had been listening to the dog's bark for a long time, and finally giving in, he approached the area with his 2 daughters to inspect it. He found a beaten-down trail leading to a garbage heap. But what he saw next left him bewildered and horrified. It was a body of a pig dressed in clothes, and he immediately assumed it was the result of a tasteless teenage prank. But then he saw the feet, and a wave of recognition washed over him. One of them was wearing a white sock. It was a child's body discovered in the field, which could potentially have been someone who took their own life, or perhaps another unfortunate victim. However, unless the Pattersons were completely isolated from the world, it would have been impossible to remain unaware of Christine's disappearance. Even Patterson's young daughters knew they'd stumbled upon a discovery that had eluded thousands of searchers for 3 long months. Without a second thought, Patterson ran back to his home and called the Durham Regional Police. The discovery of the child's remains was enough to make even the most experienced investigators feel queasy. As they peered at the skeleton, it became clear that the upper part of the body had decomposed, leaving only bones behind. But there was something even more disturbing about the scene. The legs of the child were unnaturally splayed apart and bent at the knees, eerily reminiscent of the way the notorious Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo, left his victims. It was a detail that only added to the perplexing nature of the crime. The scattered blue clothing, the pair of panties, and an abandoned running shoe suggested a possible struggle. As the investigators meticulously combed the area, their attention was drawn to another crucial discovery. A tan pouch caught their eyes. Inside, nestled snugly, was a recorder, the All-Loss number 202. The words Christine Jessop were etched onto the label. Meanwhile, in the distance, more evidence was being unearthed. Buttons, a plastic drinking glass. Each item was carefully handled and marked, waiting to reveal its secrets. As John Hilsden Smith, the chief pathologist for Ontario, examined the remains, the group of investigators around him noticed something peculiar. Despite the advanced state of decomposition, a fair amount of hair was still adhering to the scalp remains, swept forward over the skull. But it was the chain that caught their attention, with several hairs stuck into the dried flesh around it. One of them was darker and of a different thickness than the rest. To confirm her identity, dental records were checked, but the discovery that her teeth had turned pink led Smith to order a diatom test to determine if she'd drowned. However, the results were inconclusive, with so many diatoms present that Smith believed the test was contaminated. Dental records showed a match to Christine Jessop. Before the Jessop family could be informed, the detectives knocked at the house of Reverend Bev Hall and her husband. When she answered the door and saw the detective standing there, she knew what had happened. Detective Nishay briefed her and requested her presence in the room to calm down Christine's family when they received the news. When Bob and Janet saw the detectives and the Reverend in their driveway, they thought, "So this is it." Janet kept demanding, "Why? Where's Chrissy?" while Bob just wanted to know if his little girl had suffered. As the medical examiners continued to examine the remains of Christine, Smith noticed discolorations on her skull, which was evidence of not one, but 2 vicious blows. The injuries occurred before her death and were caused by a blunt object or a fall. Could it have been a hammer, a bat, or something else entirely? He couldn't say for sure. But what he did know was that Christine was still alive when she suffered that fatal blow to her head. As he sifted through the soil, his eyes fixated on an object, a rib with a deep incision caused by a sharp object. He inspected more ribs, each with nicks just a few millimeters deep, but all caused by an incredibly sharp cutting edge. The cause of death was becoming increasingly clear. The killer had mercilessly stabbed Christine. It proved a perfect explanation as to why the upper body had decomposed so quickly. The evidence at the scene was puzzling, to say the least. There were more inconsistencies and discrepancies than answers. The buttons found at the scene didn't match the color of Christine's blouse, and several of them were missing. The blue sweater that Christine's grandmother had knitted was nowhere to be found. She was found wearing a gray turtleneck sweater. The Jessops had no recollection of Christine ever owning one like it. The clothing suggested that she'd been kept somewhere else before being brought to the crime site. But the detectives had found bodily fluids on her underwear. It didn't make sense for the killer to have replaced her clothing at the site, so it seemed likely that at least one attack had taken place elsewhere. Nothing was adding up, and they knew they had to keep digging to uncover the truth. As the search for the murder weapon proved fruitless, the investigation took a chilling turn. During a subsequent search of the area, a human rib and a vertebra were found. Then, a woman named Lydia Robinson claimed to have heard screams coming from the direction of the body site one night in the beginning of October.
I heard cries for help. Help, help, and no, don't. It must have been half an hour later, a child cried out real loud, like it was hurt.
She phoned a local television station to describe what she'd heard. "Help, help, please don't," the voice cried out in desperation. The screaming started off subdued, but became increasingly frantic. After listening for several minutes, Lydia was able to determine that the sounds were coming from the south or west. The only house in that area belonged to Doug Barnes and Sharon Riseborough, but Lydia had never heard any domestic fights coming from their house before. As the screams continued, Lydia heard what sounded like a child crying before a car drove away from the area. Behind every crime lay a haunting truth, a trail of grief-stricken individuals who, for whatever reason, chose not to take action when they could have. The case was stalled until a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon with the discovery of the body, which had been discovered in Durham Region, prompting the York Police to pass the baton to the Durham Regional Police. Inspector Robert Brown was now in charge, and his team of detectives was desperate to find answers. But all leads had gone cold, and the detectives were grasping at straws. Then, on February 14, 1985, they decided to question Christine's mother. They hoped to extract any information about someone who could have harmed her daughter. Janet had no name, but the detectives refused to give up. They needed one name, just one, to crack the case wide open. And finally, after much prodding, she labeled her neighbor, Guy Paul Morin, as a weird-type guy who played the clarinet and kept honeybees. Guy Paul Morin, born in 1961 to Alphonse and Ida Morin, belonged to a family that valued privacy above all else. They were kind neighbors, always willing to lend a helping hand, and trustworthy too. Could this quiet and unassuming man really be capable of such a heinous crime? The detectives seemed to have no doubts, but Morin had a strong alibi. He'd been at his job at a furniture manufacturing facilities located 57 kilometers away from the crime scene. The detectives verified his punch-out time, 3:32 p.m., which means he couldn't have returned home before 4:14 p.m., well after Christine's parents had arrived at 4:10 p.m. The investigators probed further, questioning why Morin hadn't participated in the search for Christine on the night she disappeared. He explained that if the Jessops had asked for his help, he would have gladly joined in. However, he'd been preoccupied with assisting his father in installing weeping tile around their home's foundation. With the entire town already engaged in the search, he believed one more person wouldn't make much of a difference. Seeking to gauge his opinion of Christine, the detectives inquired about his perception of the young girl. Morin's response painted her as sweet and innocent. But then, with a habit of expressing whatever thought came to mind, he uttered a fateful remark. But they sometimes grow up to be corrupt. To the detectives, this seemingly innocent comment became a motive. In their eyes, this weird-type neighbor harbored resentment towards women, seeking retribution for what he perceived as the inevitable allure and promiscuity that would come with age. The detectives grappled with their suspicions, torn between the strong alibi and the unsettling remarks made by him. A few weeks later, Morin willingly allowed a band leader's daughter, who was actually an undercover police officer, to pluck strands of hair from the jazz group members as part of a cosmetics class project on hair analysis. The Center of Forensic Sciences became the battleground where Morin's fate hung in the balance.
They are your fingerprints, they are on her clothing, and that's your fingerprint up there. And I said, it's impossible. I have never touched that child, physically touched that child.
Suspicion had been cast upon him, and his hair sample was taken for testing. The hair found on Christine's necklace had decomposed over time, but it was still deemed consistent with Morin's sample, causing the detectives to release a sketch that matched his features. As the evening of April 22, 1985 unfolded, Guy Paul Morin found himself on the way to band practice, oblivious to the storm that was about to shatter his world. Caught off guard by flashing lights in his rearview mirror, he assumed it was a routine traffic stop for not wearing a seatbelt. Instead, those lights signaled the arrival of 14 officers who had sealed off the area.
I thought my seatbelt. I better pull over, and I did so.
He was being arrested for the murder of Christine Jessop. In utter shock, he uttered the words, "What? You're joking."
Initially, I said, "Oh, it's you guys." Like, I was surprised, really, to see them. They said, "Well, you're under arrest for the murder of Christine Jessop, your neighbor." I said, "Right. Come on, guys. You're kidding." He said, "No, Guy, we're not. We know what we're doing. We don't make mistakes."
The detectives were desperate to find holes in Morin's alibi. They retraced Janet and Ken's steps on the day of the abduction and suggested that Janet's memory was faulty. She stood by her words, but as the detectives persisted, Janet's confidence began to crumble. Eventually, she revised her timing, moving it forward to as much as 25 minutes later, leaving Morin's alibi in shambles. As January 7, 1986 dawned, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Guy Paul Morin's murder trial commenced. The prosecution's case against him was flimsy at best, relying on questionable pieces of evidence. A cigarette butt, initially regarded as a breakthrough finding, was suddenly lost when investigators realized Morin wasn't a smoker. Mysterious red fibers, supposedly linking Christine to Guy Paul's car, were presented. But an anonymous letter later revealed that the technician testing the fibers had been wearing a red sweater without a lab coat. And then there is the Moran family's account of Guy Paul's late arrival home at 5:30 p.m. on October 3, 1984. They mentioned that he went on a detour for groceries and gas after work. The police planted an undercover officer named Gordon Hobbs in Moran's cell, who later claimed that Moran had confessed to stabbing Christine, stating that he would red rum the innocent. But Moran had a different story to tell. It was later revealed that Hobbs had engaged him in a conversation about movies, where he mentioned the iconic horror film The Shining as his favorite. Unable to recall the title, he resorted to referencing red rum. Was this a twisted plot by the police to extract a confession from an innocent man, or a deceitful plan of a killer to evade justice? The lines between truth and manipulation were rapidly blurring. Defying public expectations, he was acquitted of guilt, but another appeal was launched. So in the month of May 1990, a new trial unfolded. As the proceedings commenced, the evidence remained feeble. In fact, a lot of it had disappeared from the records of the Center of Forensic Sciences, including some of Christine's bones, vital notes, and a multitude of hair and fiber samples. On July 30th, 1992, the courtroom was packed with curious onlookers as Guy Paul Moran, the man accused of murdering young Christine Jessop, walked in for a second trial. His world was turned upside down as the gavel came down and the verdict was announced: guilty of first-degree murder. He couldn't believe it. "I'm not guilty of this crime. It's a travesty of justice what's happened today," he said.
And they said, look, just be easy on yourself and just let it out. It'll save your parents lots of dollars. It'll cost your parents within a 6-digit range. And how they were right about that.
Handcuffed and led away to the Elgin Middlesex Detention Center, he knew his life would never be the same. As the reality of his life sentence sank in, a surge of panic gripped him. Desperate for a breath of fresh air in his cell, he lay flat on the cold, hard floor, his mouth pressed against the narrow opening beneath the door, gasping for air. Moran's life behind bars was a constant battle for survival. Even the most notorious killers weren't kind to a murderer of an innocent child. So he had to be safely escorted to places. He found solace in the pages of books and the study of geography. His trial had already broken records as the longest and most expensive legal ordeal in Canadian history. But the end was nowhere in sight. With the advent of DNA technology, a glimmer of hope emerged for both the detectives and the defense lawyers involved in Guy Paul Moran's case. The detectives saw an opportunity to uncover additional evidence against him, while the defense lawyers understood the risk that the DNA evidence could potentially incriminate their client.
I'm in jail for the first time, and I'm being framed, and I have lawyers that feel it's hopeless. I know I'm innocent. Now, what am I supposed to do?
Moran, however, was desperate for the truth to be revealed and urged his legal team to proceed. He was also released on bail on February 9, 1993, thanks to the work of a grassroots organization called Justice for Guy Paul Moran Committee that was established to aid him in his search for exoneration. With the second appeal looming just days away, a bombshell announcement shattered the case. The DNA test results revealed that the bodily fluid found on Christine's underwear did not belong to Moran. Charges were dropped and his record was cleared. Along with the hefty compensation of $1.25 million, he also received a public apology for the wrongful accusation and conviction, which ruined his life. It was not until January 23, 1995, almost 10 years after he was first arrested, that Moran was exonerated as a result of the DNA testing that had not previously been available. The revelation was seismic and sent shockwaves through the entire community, who realized that not only had they sent an innocent man behind bars, but that the killer was still out there. But with no further leads in hand, the case soon turned cold. 35 years later, in the year 2019, Steve Smith, a detective with the Toronto Police Force, was ready for a change. He wanted to shift his focus to cold cases. As luck would have it, the Jessop case, a mystery that had haunted him for years, had been transferred to the Toronto Police. While attending a seminar at the Ontario Police College, Smith heard about the emerging field of forensic genealogy. It sounded like just what he needed to crack the Jessop case. A few months later, a genetic testing startup called Autopsy Inc. contacted him. They'd heard about his interest in the process and offered to help. The price tag of $1,800 seemed reasonable, and Smith wasted no time securing permission from Toronto Police higher-ups. The possibility of using forensic genealogy in Canada had never been explored before. If it yielded no results, the tortured Jessop saga would endure yet another painful chapter. He submitted the DNA from Christine's underwear to Autopsy. The profile was updated to a database, GEDmatch, hoping for a break in the case. Smith eagerly awaited a golden goose match, a close relative of the killer. But the results that came back in December 2019 were nothing short of disastrous. There were only 2 matches, and they were so distant that building the family tree would involve at least 30,000 names. Smith persisted and got permission to run the DNA through a second database, Family Tree, which returned a few more matches, but still nothing close enough to identify the killer. With this progress, Smith and his team could narrow down the family tree to about 400 names. With the help of a genealogist, only known as James, who had over 3 decades of experience in the Toronto Police Department, and another genealogist from Autopsy, the team dove into a treasure trove of records, including burial and birth records, town registers, and social media. For 8 months, they tried to piece together a family tree that spanned generations. Finally, they were closing in on the real culprit. Their efforts eventually led them to a man named Henry Hoover Jr., who was born in 1804 in Lennox, Ontario. The suspect was part of his family line. But the work was far from over. They still had to trace the family tree down to the elusive culprit. Finally, they honed in on a single person, Calvin Hoover. The detectives had no idea that they were on the brink of encountering yet another twist in the tale.
We're learning more about the people that he spent time with, where he spent time, and we're looking at any unsolved cases that may be out there that Calvin could have been involved in.
Calvin Hoover was born in 1956 in Toronto Municipality in Ontario, Canada. In the mid-1970s, he met Heather, who'd traveled all the way from her native Newfoundland to Toronto. The two fell in love and got married, and Calvin became a stepfather to Heather's 2 boys. Soon after, they had 2 children of their own and rented a small home in a housing development just west of the Toronto Zoo in Oshawa. In 1984, Hoover was a 28-year-old tradesman. He held down steady employment, working for telecom companies like IBM's Rome Corporation and other firms. The man's career path was marked by constant company name changes, but his erratic behavior remained the same. He owned a 1980 gray Pontiac Phoenix. The Hoover family portrayed a perfect image. But beneath the surface, they were barely treading water, sinking deeper into debt with each passing day. Calvin Hoover had a taste for alcohol, gambling, and partying, leaving his family to struggle alone. Despite his charming demeanor outside, his family experienced his dark and cruel side. Heather, his wife, referred to him as a bit of a weirdo due to his erratic behavior. Hoover's burden of bankruptcy in 1991 was followed by unspoken struggles with anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorder. A DUI arrest in Ajax in 1996 ultimately shattered his carefully crafted facade of happy life, leading to a collapse of his marriage in 1997. Amidst the chaos, Hoover found solace in a new marriage to Joanne Jenny Roca in 2003. Hoover's life was already spiraling out of control when Jenny passed away from natural causes in 2009. Desperate and lost, Hoover began telling people in 2010 that he was contemplating taking his own life. His family and friends grew increasingly worried about him, and they even reached out to the police for help. He was spending his days as best he could. In 2015, he went on to live outside of Port Hope in a small bungalow with one of his sons. Prescribed tranquilizers had failed to alleviate his anxiety, so one day in his son's absence, Hoover resorted to taking his own life, sealing himself in the garage. He sat in the car and awaited the end as the generator hummed. He left behind a yellow sticky note with a farewell message that said, "Hope you all have a good life." Even after years of investigation that finally gave results, the detectives needed a direct DNA match to prove his guilt beyond doubt. With the discovery of 2 vials of Calvin Hoover's blood already available at the coroner's office, Detective Steve Smith was able to convince a judge to allow for genetic testing, a first in Ontario's history. The blood was entrusted to the capable hands of Kelly Bowie, a forensic scientist from Brampton, and her team at the Centre of Forensic Sciences. Finally, in October 2020, the results came in. The detectives held their breath for the answer, and it was a match. "I was in shock," Smith recalled. Christine's brother Ken considered it a miracle that the case was solved after all these years. With almost 4 decades having passed, the investigators made an attempt to piece the puzzle together with greater clarity than ever before. In the 1980s, at Eastern Independent Telecom, where wires connected businesses and communication flowed, a unique bond was forged between 2 families. Calvin and Heather were both employed at the company. Heather was a dispatcher, while Calvin was responsible for installations. Bob, Christine's father, led the charge as the lead installer. The Hoover and Jessop families started to socialize, often gathering for barbecues and birthdays. The moms became particularly close, with Janet playfully calling Heather the Goofy Newfie. Heather would often babysit Christine, who referred to her as Auntie Heather. Despite the physical distance of about 50 kilometers that separated their homes, Janet and Heather made it a point to meet regularly. On April 1st, 1984, 2 days before Christine went missing, Janet drove her kids to Hoover's house. With her husband in jail, life had become a juggling act of childcare, work, and visits to the prison. But as she chatted with her close friend Heather, little did she know that her words would prove to be a fatal mistake. Unbeknownst to Janet, Calvin Hoover overheard her mention that she'd be visiting Bob in jail in 2 days and that Christine was too young to accompany her. The opportunity to strike would have been too tempting for him. As Janet left the Hoover residence, she had no idea that her innocent comment would set off a chain of events that would lead to the disappearance of her beloved daughter. And as she drove home, Calvin Hoover was already plotting his next move, knowing that he had a small window of opportunity to carry out his twisted plan. As the school bus pulled away on October 3, 1984, leaving the quiet street behind, Calvin Hoover revved the engine of his car and waited for his moment. He'd been waiting for this opportunity for days, biding his time until the perfect moment presented itself. Did he approach her with a smile and a friendly wave, luring her into the car with promises of seeing her father? Or did he use force, snatching her up in his arms and carrying her kicking and screaming to the car? There isn't a way to know that for sure. But what we do know is that by 4:10 p.m., Christine was in Calvin's car, hurtling down the road towards a fate that no one could have imagined. At only 40 pounds, Christine wouldn't have been a match for the full-grown man behind the wheel. Everyone was grappling with the question of why her body had been found in a remote, desolate area of Sunderland, miles away from her hometown of Queensville. Yet there was a hidden connection, known only to Calvin Hoover. He had a friend who lived just a few kilometers from that very spot. They shared a love of kayaking and backcountry camping, and Calvin knew the area like the back of his hand. He'd found the perfect place to hide his horrific crime, where he could go unnoticed and undisturbed. As Calvin Hoover went about his daily life, trying to bury the dark secrets of his past, his wife Heather held on to a haunting reminder of the little girl he'd taken from them. A photo Christine had given her, capturing her sweet smile and innocent nature, was kept in a prominent spot as a constant reminder of what had been lost. Meanwhile, Hoover put on a facade of empathy and concern, offering words of comfort and support to his wife. He had successfully evaded the grasp of law enforcement for an astonishing 36 years. His audacity knew no bounds as he played the role of an innocent helper in the search for young Christine Jessop when she initially vanished. But Hoover's sinister game didn't stop there. He shamelessly attended Christine's wake, mingling among grieving friends and family members. 3 separate police forces, York, Durham, and Toronto, tirelessly pursued the truth, their investigations intertwining in a desperate race to uncover the killer. Yet Hoover remained one step ahead, owing all to his good luck. He would have silently watched as the media frenzy surrounding Christine Jessop's murder unfolded. As investigators combed through countless leads in the Christine Jessop case, his name kept showing up in the case files that seemed purely irrelevant. Heather was asked about his whereabouts, and she had initially told the officers that her husband was working that day. But she later realized that he'd been busy taking care of their children at home instead. However, Calvin was never cross-questioned. The revelation left a shockwave of emotions in its wake, with even those remotely connected to the case feeling the aftershocks. Calvin Hoover's family was devastated after learning about the details. His ex-wife Heather was stunned that she'd spent years with someone capable of such heinous acts.
Shared exclusively with CBC on behalf of her family, she says, "Our hearts go out to the Jessop family. We ask for privacy at this time while we all come to terms with this horrendous news that was as shocking to us as it was to the Jessop family."
And grappled with whether to reach out to the Jessops. Haunted by the trial and grisly crime scene, memories plagued the detectives like lingering ghosts. Bernie Fitzpatrick carried a burden of guilt and remorse for the mistakes made during the investigation. He said, "I feel bad about it, but look, the cops pick up the rocks. It's the attorneys who break the windows." Ken Jessop, Christine's brother, described the family's journey through the 7 stages of grief, from disbelief to hope.
It's over now. The end has come, and we have now some closure, and that was very, very important to get the right closure.
Bob had remarried over the years, but was still burdened by his daughter's unsolved murder. Learning of Hoover's DNA match unleashed a surge of anger.
So that was the unknown thing at the time, and unbelievable to a degree as to why he would even do it.
He said, "If I could, I'd line him up and blow his brains out." Whereas Guy-Paul Morin still faced challenges finding employment and acceptance despite his exoneration. Enrolling his son in a nearby kindergarten school just brought outrage over his past. The school administration immediately told Morin that his son was no longer welcome. Despite the hardships, the latest update in the investigation brought a sense of vindication. He said that he always believed that DNA would eventually reveal the true killer.
My DNA, the scientists, I commemorate them 100%, knowing that they did a beautiful job. The scientists, they exonerated me.
As Guy-Paul Morin, now a free man, visited Christine's grave for the first time, he softly whispered the words, "Rest in peace there, little girl." Before the wheels of justice could catch up with Calvin Hoover, he became his own victim when he met his end, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and unanswered questions. Among his victims was Christine, Guy-Paul Morin, thousands of Queensville residents who forgot what safety felt like, and even himself. With his own life extinguished, Hoover evaded the true consequences of his heinous deeds, leaving behind a haunting reminder that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. While the pain and trauma of this case will never be fully healed, the resolution of the case brought a sense of peace and closure to those affected by the tragedy. How do you think Christine got in the car? Was she forced or convinced? Why do you think it took the investigators so long to solve the case? Let us know what your thoughts are in the comment section. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear from you.